Chris Bowen, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Jeremy.
Should workers get their hopes up about an eventual wage increase from the stimulation these prospective company tax cuts may provide?
No, on the government's own figures, they say wages will increase by $2 a day in 20 years' time. That's hardly cause to think this is an exciting time to be an Australian. At the same time as the government's supporting cuts to penalty rates, which would be the biggest wage cut since the Great Depression, and arguing that there shouldn't be an increase in the minimum wage. So no, if under the Turnbull government, if you're an ordinary wage worker, you have cause to be greatly concerned and disappointed. We have wages growth at a record low levels in Australia, and the Turnbull government seems to think that the answer to that is even lower wages.
The chiefs of some of the country's biggest businesses say this is the only plan Australia has for driving growth and investment. Are they wrong?
Well, I disagree with them, and I understand they're going to argue for a tax cut for their own entities. That's in their own best interest. I understand that, and everybody would like a tax cut. But when we're talking about priorities for the budget and the government of the day, they also argue, the Business Council argues, the necessity for urgent budget repair, returning to structural budget balance, protecting the AAA rating. I agree with all those things. You can't argue for those and a $50 billion tax cut. The BCA has also correctly argued that we need to have a 10-year funding plan for big things like the NDIS and the Gonski school funding model, but they argue that that's not the case for a corporate tax cut, and I respectfully, strongly disagree.
If these company tax cuts do go through in part or in full, can Labor still afford to keep its policy pledges like fully funding Gonski, for instance?
Well, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. The Senate will sit late tonight, and there's all sorts of speculation about how much they'll pass and what they'll pass. The last I saw of Nick Xenophon's public position was that he wouldn't pass anything over $10 million unless there was an emissions intensity scheme introduced. I don't think that's going to happen. Malcolm Turnbull would love to have an emissions intensity scheme. I don't think he'd get it through his party room. So there'll be all sorts of speculation. We'll see overnight what they pass. The only party, frankly, that's been utterly consistent on this is us, who've argued for a 2 million threshold since the night of the last budget.
But Labor's funding outlook does depend in some part to these tax cuts going through.
No, that's not right, Jeremy. We've announced various mechanisms to fund our initiatives like reform of negative gearing, reform of capital gains tax, reform of superannuation, and we'll have much more to say. We always make sure that our plans are funded over the decade, and in fact a better budget line, bottom line than the government over the decade, and we'll continue to do that.
Does that funding prospectively require more debt?
No, Jeremy, as I've said, we've made tough decisions like reforming negative gearing, capital gains tax and superannuation, things the government hasn't had the courage to do, particularly in relation to capital gains tax and negative gearing. They finally came to the party on superannuation, but we still have a policy which is better for the budget bottom line than the government's on superannuation. And we'll have more to say about how we fund important promises and, importantly, engage in budget repair.
So if a particular band of companies does get these tax cuts as appear likely, will Labor pledge to let them stand?
Well, Jeremy, again, let's see what happens in the Senate tonight, and we'll have more to say in due course about that. There's also, you could run through all sorts of speculation about what might happen in the Senate. The government is clearly scrambling.
But there's a matter of certainty here for business that if they can expect these company tax cuts to be reversed, possibly under Labor, they would like to know that now.
Well, the next election is not tomorrow, it's not next week, I doubt it's this year. Our policy will be very clear in relation to company tax, personal tax, reform of the taxation system. We've taken very detailed policies to the people at the last election, the most robust, forward-leaning, detailed policy offering of any opposition since 1993, and that'll be the case next time as well.
I want to take you to the issue of the minimum wage submissions that have been made. The Employment Minister today on radio said that low-income earners are, in her words, often found in high-income households. Is there at least some element of truth to that?
I think it just shows how out of touch this government is. I mean, low-income earners tend to be in low-income households. I would have thought that that's a pretty uncontroversial statement. And for the government to argue today for no increase in the minimum wage, which is what they're doing, and to justify that by saying somehow low-income workers have rich husbands or rich wives, which is effectively what they're arguing, as justification. And then they elsewhere argued they're young and single. I mean, it's a pretty confused sort of argument. Our position is clear. There should be an increase in the minimum wage. We've made the case for that. As I said, wages growth in Australia is at a record lows, and the minimum wage has been declining as a proportion of average wages over the last 20 years. We don't want to go down the American road of a working poor. We don't want people working hard and still having to get support and finding it difficult to make ends meet. The minimum wage is a very important social contract and condition which Labor has fought for over the years, will continue to fight for, and we argue for an increase.
Now, the unions are pushing for a $45 a week pay increase. Business groups are looking at something closer to $8 to $10, which is closer to inflation. Labor hasn't nominated a particular amount. What faith should voters have that Labor would stick to whatever Fair Work decides?
Well, because we've put in a submission saying there should be an increase. Now, it's not the role of the Labor Party to put a dollar figure on that. We've put arguments to the Commission about why there should be an increase, unlike the government, who's argued there should not be an increase, a very important difference. Labor Party has consistently made submissions that there should be an increase and underpin that with arguments about why. Now, what we don't traditionally do is put a dollar figure on that. The ACTU is entitled to put their case. They're not only entitled, they're obliged to put their case, representing the workers of Australia. I understand employers will put their case. We'll put ours, which is that there should be a reasonable increase.
Is your credibility somewhat damaged, though, by going back on what Fair Work decided for penalty rates, though?
So, on the contrary, Jeremy, our credibility in protecting low-wage earners is enhanced, because what we've done is said the Liberal Party is happy to overturn the Road Safety Tribunal when they don't like the judgment. They're indeed happy to overturn the federal court when they don't like a judgment in relation to native title. But all of a sudden, when it comes to low-wage workers, that's sacrosanct. Now, we were faced with the choice of the independence of the Commission or protecting low-wage workers. We've gone for the latter, and parliaments do that, including as we speak. Parliaments overturn the decisions of tribunals and courts on a regular basis. That is our job as parliamentarians, where we feel the national interest would oblige us to do that. We do that. The difference is we feel that low-wage earners deserve that protection. The Liberal and National parties do not.
Chris Bowen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.